Hey guys, welcome back. So now getting into X-Force, which has literally gone non-stop since like the first issue. And like in my mind, I could just imagine like Benjamin Percy and Jonathan Hickman sitting down having a conversation and Percy just being like, oh, the X-Men can do what? Okay, so you mean I can do, oh man, we about to have fun with this. Because it's not just where he takes the story, but it's also like him throwing in things that we'd seen with Jonathan Hickman within Powers of 10 and House of X. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so jumping right in because there's a lot we gotta talk about. Because first, starting this off in a place to where Krakowa is a new nation, and just recently they went through their legal-ish means of becoming a nation with the assistance of Emma Frost like we had seen in House of X, but along with becoming this safe haven for mutants to come to from around the world, Charles already knew that there's gonna have to be some sketchy sort of things that he needed to do, which initially started with Emma Frost swaying some of the votes, and prior to the point of us getting to X-Force, the Marauders were like your most recent example, with them smuggling goods on and off the island, but in addition to that, also helping other mutants who had trouble making their ways to the different Krakowan gates around the world, which would then cause the Marauders to step in to guarantee their safe travel. But just adjacent to the Marauders, you have the Hellfire Club, who are essentially the means which Charles Xavier has used. With them already being plugged all over the world, Charles needed these connections so that even though certain countries refused to take specific imports from Krakowa, but by way of the Hellfire Club's previous resources, in addition to the strong hand of the Marauders, this was like the beginning of Charles making moves to secure Krakowa by any means, which also started Charles creating a number of companies like Xavier Pharmaceuticals, Blackbird Motors, Wolverine Waste Management, just to name a few. And we should probably like just have a whole video talking about like Charles Xavier's portfolio. Because once Krakowa was legally a nation, these businesses started rolling out back to back to back, and mainly to strengthen the wealth of that nation to better protect the mutants who were there, but also gradually make it in one of the most powerful countries in the world, because money talks. But in addition to this, early on when Krakowa had first become a nation, and also during the early stages of a number of these startups, Charles also sent Domino to do a secret investigation on a number of shell companies who had ties to either anti-mutant politicians or anti-mutant businesses, which is a mission that definitely goes into the under-the-table dealings that Charles Xavier is doing. But in this case, it's one of the most critical, because when it comes to intel for the island of Krakowa and for mutant kind, this literally could mean life or death, because even with all the information that they've received from Moira McTaggart, those were from past lifetimes. And though all that information is very critical, and certain echoes from those lifetimes do come back, but it's not like a roadmap to tell them what's going to happen in this lifetime. So it's for that very reason that gathering intel is critical. And so now in the case of Domino, who had been following these leads, one of them eventually led her to like a 35-year-old Irishman who worked at an investment firm, and he hosted a number of anti-mutant dark web chat rooms by night, to which Domino caught wind of, got into the dude's emails, to where she found flight itinerary to Seoul, South Korea, which led her to what she believed to be one of these meetings, but when she arrived she was made almost immediately. And the way that she got caught up, it was like initially it had seemed like this was a secret meetup for just humans, and presumably another one of those dark web uploads, to where the title of their next video was going to be like mutant sovereignty and what we're going to do about it. But when the meeting started, to make sure nobody there was a mutant, they started pricking their fingers, testing for blood, seemingly just to make sure that everyone there was human. But as it turned out, they knew that Domino had been tracking them for some time, and they had essentially left breadcrumbs with the flight itineraries and the emails about the meetups, because they knew that these clues would lead her directly to them. And prior to this point, Domino would report back to Krakowa promptly at 2400 hours every day. But with these meetings that would take place at night, it actually took place at about the same time that she would report back, which left Krakowa roughly 24 hours behind her current location, or really any of her most recent updates. But so when we jump back to Krakowa and we catch up with Beast, who was minding his business studying the island just before getting mauled by a grizzly billy goat bear, and like really, I don't know what to call that thing but ugly. But lucky for Hank, he's saved by Logan, who quickly just gets this thing off of him and chases it away. But for Beast, this was a quick lesson and a bit of foreshadowing, because for Beast, he didn't feel like he needed to be looking over his shoulder. And prior to this point, Logan was aware of this thing like lurking around and being a creeper. But with this happening, it was a quick lesson for Hank to remember, like, no matter where you are, even if it's this safe haven known as Krakowa, that even still, no matter what, that there are always predators. And so at this point in time, as far as like your security for Krakowa, which has this external nervous system which extends both aquatic and in the atmosphere, to where at the helm of it you have Black Tom Cassidy, who we've known prior to this point more so as a villain of the X-Men, the cousin of Banshee, cellmate of Juggernaut, and the dude that controls plants. But essentially he's pretty perfect for this role, because rather than just saying Krakowa is going to take care of everything, we instead have Black Tom who connects through Krakowa and connects with the plankton in the water for like 25 square miles, so he'll know who or what's approaching in the water, or even he'll connect with the pollen or the spores to monitor above Krakowa, once again up to 25 square miles, and use this connection which Krakowa allows as an extension of his nervous system and act literally as a living, breathing security alarm. But also around this time, we see that he's detected the Marauders heading up the shore, to where this time they bring in Colossus, who's been hurt pretty bad, and mainly from coming into resistance from helping other mutants from different countries around the globe, to whom most of which are fully against everything that Krakowa is doing, much like we'd seen when we had talked about Marauders, when we seen them run into some of that resistance. But not long after, when Charles is preparing to go to Sokovia, and really it's a trip for him to get a treaty signed, just in and out for him to head back. But while he's on his way, he gets a word from Sage, who gives him the update that she still hasn't heard from Domino since she's gone dark, but she also lets Charles know that she'll keep looking, and if she does find anything, she'll let him know as soon as possible. But when Charles arrives here in Sokovia, we switch to this group of well-built men and women who are boarding a flight from Seoul, South Korea directly to Honolulu, Hawaii. And as they're boarding the plane, it's like you can tell like they're up to something, because they're looking at different people, like the dude who's loading luggage on the plane to the dude who's signaling the plane. Like there's a lot of weird eye contact, like it's super sketchy. But as far as Charles, who's here in Sokovia, to where like I mentioned, just in and out getting this treaty signed, and after that heading right back to Krakowa. But while he's there shaking hands and getting this picture taken, and really just more or less doing the whole song and dance that just goes with political stuff, but while he's there, one of the servers slip a tracker in his drink so that when he ingests it, he'll take it back with him to Krakowa. And now I'm not saying that's part of the song and dance. With that part, I was just talking about the pictures and everything, not slipping nano trackers in the drink. But as it turns out, the sketchy, well-built travelers who were heading to Honolulu, they had really just used the flight as a cover-up, with its route passing over Krakowa so that they would drop down on the island around the same time that Charles Xavier got back. And when they fall through, like they are coming in hot. Like I don't know how high that plane was, but it had them dropping through like a cluster of shooting stars. But with doing this, for reasons that we'll get to later, they actually appeared as Domino returning to the island of Krakowa, which is what allowed them to enter to Krakowa from the skies without setting off an alert. But even with Krakowa and Sage picking them up as Domino, Black Tom knew that something wasn't right. And even though he goes to tell Charles Xavier, Charles just lets him know more or less that you gotta trust the rest of this team the same way that I'm telling them to trust you. Which makes sense with Black Tom's background, but even still, like his mutant power connects him to Krakowa like an extension of his nervous system, which theoretically could make him a bit more sensitive than Krakowa. And if you ask me, like if he feels like something ain't right, then that's a viable argument. But the messed up part is how right he was, because when these mercenaries touched down, as soon as they hit the ground, like it was a slaughter. And although they already have in mind who their primary target is, they were still adamant on killing as many mutants as they could along the way. Like it was really messed up. And it's like you can tell like from their attack that this thing was planned out. But granted, like even with that and them having the element of surprise, like once that was gone, the mutants started taking them out fairly quickly. Like with Black Tom, who for him the whole island is a weapon, and once Wolverine made his way back from the outskirts, which was pretty quick. And I remember having like a trading card back in the day that said Wolverine could run somewhere between 25 to 30 miles an hour, which as a kid I was like, ooh, cool. But now like looking back, it's like how you do that with 2 legs and you're not a speedster. And plus back then Wolverine was like 5'3" in the comics, so picture that. But when Wolverine gets back, we see a bit of that concept return when he had mentioned the Beast, that there are always predators. And pretty much everything that Wolverine has said, it applies to everybody on the island. Being comfortable and feeling safe, which is something that Jean even mentions at this point, that they've all made that mistake collectively. But at this point, with them pretty much stopping all of the mercenaries except for one who they need to catch quickly, because at this point Charles hasn't made it back to cover yet. But essentially that last mercenary, he knows exactly where to find Charles, and when he does, Logan, Jean, and Hank are not able to get there on time. And as they approach, all they hear is that one shot. And like when I first seen this, man, like it was almost like a movie. Like like when everything goes silent, but it's like the action is still going, but everything's like in slow motion. Because after that single shot, Logan took like 3 to the chest and he immediately started playing operator with the dude's intestines. And I don't mean operator like doctor, I mean operator like unplug this here and put that there type of situation. Like Logan was connecting a collect call from his gallbladder to his lymph nodes or something. But when this happened, like it just felt just like a movie, like where everything goes quiet and it's like you already know like the worst has already happened. And even now in this moment, you have Sage, like she's trying to reach out to Hank, she's trying to reach out to Jean, to Black Tom, and to Logan, because she's looking at the senses while this is happening. But even from where she's at, looking at the fact of what happened, she still can't believe that Charles Xavier is dead. And even with Logan, Jean, and Hank seeing this with their own eyes, they find it hard to believe themselves. And so now, okay, check this out. So now, like with the new system of rebirthing mutants, and the way that it's set up with the 5 who would physically bring the mutant back, and after that, Charles Xavier would upload their minds back into their body, at this point in time, they have done this countless times over and over again. But from where they stand, this is the first time that they've run into this with Charles, to whom, from what we know from like House of X, when he requested for Forge to think of a way to not only make it possible for Cerebro to back up mutants as far as their consciousness while scanning their minds, but also for Forge to figure out a way for them to do this with multiple backups, which is exactly what has come back to at this point, with Charles in need of that backup for himself and eventually for everyone else, with him assassinated and Cerebro destroyed. So it's like, because of what we've seen in House of X, we know that there are other copies of Cerebro located somewhere that could fix this. But even still, like for the mutants, bringing Charles back, this is the first time, and rightfully so. There's a lot of skepticism, like what if this doesn't work? Like what will we do then? And I like that we see that, because it's essentially like we see them doubt in this time of despair. But even when this happens, we see Magneto hold true to a promise which he had made to Charles back in House of X. Because if you guys remember, back when Charles and Moira went to visit Magneto and pretty much tell him what needed to be done, after Magneto had seen the previous timelines and he agreed to work with Charles, he also told him that they will scope this new path together, and if Charles would falter, that Magneto wouldn't. But even with doing so, he understood that Charles was going to have to take on a different path from what he had dreamed. And it's here, like in a sign of faith and encouragement, when Jean starts to show a bit of doubt about them bringing Charles back for the first time. And it's here where Magneto reshaped Cerebro and made it into a sword to symbolize the continuation of Charles Xavier's path. And as different as the sword was from Cerebro, so will the vision of Charles Xavier moving forward, like a monument that once represented the rebirth of the people, of which it still does, with many of their memories still in it, but now it's also been reformed as a sword that is ready to fight and protect. And I gotta tell you, man, like this whole idea of the Cerebro sword, it completely blows my mind, because it's so poetic and so appropriate for X-Force. But from here, Jean and Hank of course go to Crater 1, which is one of the locations around Krakowa, to where they have nearby spare Cerebros, to where at this time it's a very tricky process, not just getting it started up, but essentially doing the rebirthing process without Charles present, because once again he's done this every time. But while Hank and Jean are taking care of that, we jump over to the healing gardens, to where this autopsy for these mysterious mercenaries is underway. And while they're cutting these dudes open, they come to find out like each one of them was like built for war. Like they had extra bones in their forearms to pull as weapons, which kind of sound like somebody else in the room. But they also had their teeth like cored with putty explosives, their ears were like spooled with wire for either choking people or climbing. Like everything on their body was a weapon. But essentially when Logan gets here and he discovers that one of them is still alive, he also overhears them talk about the skin graft from Domino's skin, which they used to fool Krakowa's defenses, and he tells them to get Jean in there as soon as possible to get as much information as she can out of that last mercenary's mind, so they can use that to find Domino. And it's pretty funny to see like Wolverine go on his hunt, because he started his investigation by going back to the airport and pretty much backtracking the plane that had passed over Krakowa, which was pretty smart by the way. But when he goes, like he can't get past like the security software, and he's typing on the computer like one finger at a time, and when he's just like hitting buttons, he goes to the camera looking right towards him and he sees the guard walking in behind him. Like it's pretty hilarious, and like this guard is anything but trouble for Wolverine, and so it's like he's not necessarily worried about about him. But like when he turns around to shut him up real quick, he's essentially stopped by Kid Omega, who essentially is a huge help coming along here in helping out Logan, because aside from telepathy and telekinesis, he can also process information like super fast, which immediately comes in handy when he takes the password from the security guard's mind, and he immediately knows how to use the security software to find exactly what they need to backtrack the flight of the mercenaries and find the tag of the vehicle that they arrived at the airport in, which was pretty clutch because it essentially led them back to the location of a printing press. But as ironic as it was a printing press, like when they got there, this place was straight up just printing out killers, and almost like Build-A-Bear, but instead you walk in and you point at a picture of John Wick. But while they were there back in Krakowa, Jean had stepped away from bringing back Charles so that she could quickly scan the mind of the surviving mercenary, and mainly because Wolverine did such a number on him, there's no telling how long he'll hold out. But with going into his mind, which Jean described as dark, but even with that, all she saw with this mask, who someone was hiding behind with remnants of a peacock, and with seeing this, she really just didn't know what to make of it, at least not yet. But back in South Korea with Wolverine and Kid Omega, who are still snooping through the build your own killer factory. But while they're there, Kid Omega gets grabbed by a dude that looked like Inside Out Boy from like Nickelodeon. At least I think that was Nickelodeon. Man, that's a throwback. I don't know if y'all gonna catch that. But also when this happens, it's like the red alert that Kid Omega's powers are not working. But fortunate enough for Wolverine, like everything he does is pretty much analog, so like you can't make like adamantium not be adamantium unless you're like Magneto, then that's a whole nother problem. But with Kid Omega losing his powers and telling Wolverine like, look, I'm not like you, I'm not a killing machine. And Wolverine, who pretty much knows like, you know, he's the best there is at what he does, and what he does isn't good. But at this point in time, with all these half-baked psychos running around the place, he just lets Kid Omega know like, bro, you better learn quick. And he does pretty well. He protects himself from the little head and spine that try to grab him real quick. But at the same time, it was kind of like a red flag because all of these dudes coming after them, as well as something dampening their powers, like this can only add up to them hiding something, which of course was correct because here at this factory, they were hiding Domino, to whom they was grafting her skin to a number of these different mercenaries. And I'm not gonna front, man, like it broke my heart a little bit just to see Domino there like that. And it's like, even though we have like the whole concept of being able to bring people back or even just give them new bodies, it's like even still you got to keep in mind like the psychological damage that stays with them when they remember all of this. And I know like even like all the way back towards like House of X, I would see like in the comments like a lot of you guys were kind of concerned about the whole thing of bringing people back and more or less kind of wondering like where's the gravity or the threat if you can do that. But even on the flip side of that, I make the argument that the scars that are in their mind, that they definitely weigh much heavier than their physical bodies, which will be destroyed and they'll just get a new one. Like some of these experiences might low-key change some of these people forever. But essentially with Wolverine and Kid Omega, like when they get Domino out of her containment and they're immediately chased down by the hulking Big Nasty, it's here where Domino finally gets enough strength to tell them that the device around her neck, that is actually a power inhibitor and that they'll need to destroy it in order to get their powers back. And as soon as Wolverine destroys it, like Kid Omega, he's able to whip up his signature sonic rocket launcher and it's a wrap. But not long after this, going back to Krakowa, when we get back to that last mercenary that has survived, who they've hardly been keeping alive with the healer just to get more information out of him, because they really just need all the intel they can use so they can figure out who's behind this and why. But when they leave him alone in the healing gardens, a shadow figure steps in, suffocates the dude, and he's gone, just like that. And with how it happened, it wasn't really anything that anyone looked into after, mainly because how bad his condition was, and they were more or less expecting to lose him anytime soon. But around this time, we go back to Jean, who's returned to Hank to assist him in bringing back Charles Xavier. And it's pretty crazy because Jean and Hank are having this conversation, which initially started with, I want to say, Hank asking Jean if she believes like they'll ever miss death. And throughout the conversation, she mentions that she's died a number of times, which immediately made me think of something I'd seen a while back, like when Chris Claremont killed off Jean with the Phoenix Saga, and Jim Shooter, who's like editor-in-chief at the time, he pretty much promised Chris Claremont that he wouldn't allow Jean to be resurrected, which as we know, that definitely happened. And now like in the hands of Hickman, like everybody's coming back. And like just that thought has me curious to like what would Chris Claremont, like what would he say, like what would he think about this? And I mean like really like of his thoughts of like Dawn of X like all together. Like, I'm curious to know. But essentially with Jean and Hank, we do see that they're successful at bringing back Charles Xavier, but also when they do this, it's like close to the time when Magneto, he's supposed to speak to the public, and like just before he does, Black Tom is in his ear, like, if you don't make an example out of these people, I will. And really for Black Tom, a lot of that is coming out of the hurt that he feels because this essentially happened on his watch. But as soon as Magneto steps through to address the press and possibly even tell them that Charles is dead, because at this point I don't even think he got the update just yet, but before he can even utter a word, Charles steps through right behind him and Charles assures the world that he's alive and kicking, which at this point is a double entendre. But even still, with them seeing him alive, there's plenty of speculation and people wondering if this was actually him, and quite similarly to his words to Black Tom just before he was killed, like his last words, he told the media that just like before in the beginning, like they're gonna have to just trust him and just take his word that this is him, much like they did before any of all this. But in addition to this, and just as like an extra bit before we wrap up, like not long after this press meeting, Magneto actually gave the Cerebro sword as a gift to Charles, and with doing so he told Charles to keep it close to him. And even with doing so, Charles took the sword and he sat it above his bed, like on the wall above his bed in his living quarters. And even after that, Charles would say at times that he could hear the data still moving through the sword at night when he goes to sleep. But even with doing so, like, he has never slept better, which is pretty crazy because I really feel like this sword is gonna be pretty significant later on. Alright, so jumping right back in at the press reveal of Charles Xavier being alive and well, this pretty much handled everything as far as the world not thinking that Krakowa was falling apart. But even still with this happening, Charles needed to come up with some sort of solution to, one, prevent things like this when possible, but also secondly, have a solution that would act like your special forces, if you will, but with the main focus on the nation's interest. And with Magneto soon after Charles' resurrection, giving him the gift of the Cerebro sword, which Magneto made out of the previous shattered pieces of Cerebro, this also symbolized the nation of Krakowa, to whom also technically kind of live inside the sword as well, at least previous versions of themselves. But this sword also symbolized like a reforming or a transformation, or better yet, a repurposing of the people, much like we talked about in the previous video. But so now, as far as catching up with Wolverine, Domino, and Kid Omega, like right after Kid Omega blew up the tall order of Raging Assassin, Extra Muscle, Hold the Skin, like that was a moment when they had finally got out and finally got a second to breathe. And after getting out of this factory, Kid Omega took the time to try to piece back together Domino, pretty much the best that he could as far as her mind and her body, both of which she expresses is pretty messed up at the moment. And with her brain scrambled because of all the things that they put her through, she even admits that she doesn't remember a lot of the intel that she collected prior to winding up in this place. And if anybody understands, it's definitely Logan. But he also makes the suggestion that they can go back in, do a sweep, and possibly get some of that intel back. But Domino's like, nope, I don't think that's a good idea. And as soon as she says that, like the factory explodes, like all the evidence, everything gone. And the timing with Domino saying that was like perfect. Wolverine was like, how'd you know? She's like, lucky guess. And it's like, well, okay, those powers is back. But after this, we catch up with them attending a meeting inside of the Point, which is more or less a smaller round table within Krakowa behind the waterfall, so that they can not only address the confidentiality of what had just happened with the attempt on assassinating Charles Xavier, because prior to this point, with all the calamity that had taken place, and I think 33 mutants were killed overall, counting Charles Xavier, but even with them having their own resolve for the casualties, people still talk. Rumors made their way out, and this is more so what Xavier and Magneto had to deal with when addressing the press, to which they handled well and they denied everything. But the main reason of them gathering here is to discuss deniable operations, because much like these mercenaries operated in the shadows, Charles believes that similarly they need to operate in more than just one way, and to do so with one hand turning the page and moving forward, but also with the other hand always in a fist, ready to be a force for good at all times, to which at this point sparks the beginning of a new X-Force. And so now there's one thing that kind of just standing out to me like super crazy within this meeting that Charles mentions, which is about these mercenaries and their leader, to whom they only know at this point he's behind a mask, he has a peacock tattoo, I'm not judging. But when Charles makes the statement of really just stating the facts and addressing how these mercenaries have enhanced themselves, and not just turning themselves into weapons, but also bioengineering. Like when I see this, I can't help but think of Powers of 10. Like towards the conclusion, when it came down to the Ascension, and we were told about mankind and their vision of becoming these supermen, which is essentially the end goal after the Sentinel program and the Nimrods, the Mother Modes. And this is essentially like one of the things I was referring to, what I mentioned in the last video, as far as echoes from the past making their way into the present. And so like, don't be surprised if we have another event called Days of Past Present. And I know that probably won't happen, but even still, you know I gotta say it. But really, essentially, it does feel like this group is gearing towards doing something to that nature. And even when they had used Domino's skin and grafted it onto their soldiers, it was really like this was one example of them going beyond the machinery and stepping into that bioengineering, very similar to what led to the Ascension. But so now, just for a little bit more clarity about this mysterious group, what we do know about them at this point is that they are comprised of different politicians, others in high seats of power, or those who are just wealthy, and collectively they come together under the name of Xeno. And as far as like the name of the organization being Xeno, Charles and the others, they're not yet aware of this. But I got a feeling that it won't be long before they figure this out. But as for Charles and the others, after their meeting adjoins at the point, they then make their way from there to another part of Krakowa called the Grove in order to have a follow-up meeting with the Quiet Council. But while this is happening over on the eastern seaboard at the Xavier Pharmaceuticals distribution site, which at the time during the Quiet Council meeting was being guarded by Multiple Man, who was paid a visit by a group of mercenaries from a different description. But as far as Multiple Man, aka Magic's Prime, who apparently was outnumbered and overtaken. Like, what can I say? They caught him slipping. But after discovering this breach, Jean goes in with Hank and Sage in order to do an investigation and try to figure out if this infiltration or these mercenaries are tied to the ones who previously infiltrated Krakowa and attempted to assassinate Charles Xavier. And at this time, Jean, she's already debriefed Multiple Man, so she's able to show Sage and Hank a mental projection of everything that Madrox has seen, like on site at the location. And I like how she makes the comparison of this projection to like your police sketch for a suspect. Like it's not exactly one-to-one, but it'll give you an idea at least of who and what we're looking for. And even though it's not exact, it's really helpful because at least with looking, Beast can tell that for one, they're using different weapons, but also for these mercenaries, like their tactical gear is brand name, which now presents the issue of like, okay, who else is staging attacks on Krakowa and what exactly do they want? But as it turns out, Sage puts quite a bit together after seeing this projection of who they were, where they went, and not as specific to their identity, but to the fact of them using scuba gear, which could only go short distance, and them using a chopper to get close enough to use the scuba gear, but also the winds were crazy, so the chopper couldn't have gone too far, which also lets her know that they had came by a nearby ship. And even though their attack seemed that they were just robbing the pharmaceuticals and taking some pedals, Sage then quickly discovered that that was only a cover-up, but instead they made their way here to access a hub in order to transfer money because that is truly what they were looking for. And so now what's wild is like all of this makes its way back to the meeting with the Quiet Council. But first, just to catch up a bit on where the meeting started, initially Charles was presenting the idea of how X-Force would be structured, and with doing so he made the analogy to Hercules, to whom for much of his younger life he hid on Earth amongst mortals, but after his true nature was revealed to himself, he then underwent the gauntlet and began his quest to become divine and achieve immortality. But even with doing so, Xavier lets them know that Hercules would have perished had he not had his half-sister Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and for that reason it is important to operate with both the muscle and the mind. But so now after this recent attack, it really pushes the conversation to like, okay, like what are we gonna do about this? And Sebastian Shaw kind of pokes fun at Apocalypse, like what are we gonna do, send a sandstorm and like a bunch of scarab beetles? And Sinister even makes a suggestion like, you know what, we'll just kill them all, how about that? And it's like he's smiling saying it, but he is so serious. And like I promise you, like had somebody gassed him in this meeting, like he would have went through the whole motion and everything. But in the middle of this, Jean kind of switches back to the serious tone, and it's like, yeah, sure, Charles is back and he's alive, but she tells them like there has to be a moment that you guys remember during that, like that feeling in her gut, like what if this doesn't work and what if we can't bring back Charles? And it's here where she shows them how organized and how put together their enemy is. And it's like almost immediately the conversation sways to like, okay, well they have their council and they also have their soldiers. And like when Exodus makes that observation, and it's pretty much the reason like why they're here. Like even before that, it was the reason for this meeting. And so when Charles follows this with bringing back the idea of X-Force and telling them like it's more than a team or a militia, and it's like immediately Mystique sits forward and she's like, oh, you mean like a mutant CIA? Like she gets excited, like she's ready for all that. The interrogations, the espionage, and she's pretty much like, wait, where do we start? But it's also here that we get the clearer analogy to what Charles had mentioned about Hercules, with Athena being the CIA and Hercules being the Delta Force. And with that structure, X-Force will have its mind and its muscle. And so after this, jumping over to the armory where we catch up with Forge, who has been making all kind of new gadgets merged with Krakowan organics and coming up with just all sorts of new weapons. And it's where Domino, Logan, and Kid Omega meet him here to re-up on some weapons before they head out. It's here where Forge gives Domino this organic gauntlet, which I'd like to call the vegan mitten, and you don't want to get smitten with that vegan mitten. But essentially it's Krakowan in nature, but it'll do pretty much anything that she can think of and be whatever weapon she needs it to be whenever she needs it to be that. And as far as maintenance, Forge is like, just make sure you root and water it at night, and aside from that, you good. Like it'll never run out of ammo, which is pretty wild. Like 24 hours not having to reload. Like I know a few Call of Duty heads who wouldn't mind having one of those. But also, while they're here, here's the interesting thing, because Logan's walking around and he comes across this huge container of adamantium. And I remember a lot of you guys were asking back during House of X, like where are they getting the adamantium whenever they rebirth Wolverine? And at the time I had my theories and I made my assumptions as far as like Magneto making it work out. But it's like now we at least have the definite answer, seeing Forge with a large amount of adamantium, of which he also mentions that it was the professor's orders, so that when they bring back Wolverine, he comes back adamantium and all. But in addition to that, it's like Wolverine is like, you know what, Forge, I got a request. But as soon as he says that, they get an alert from Sage, there's another heist on the way and they gotta go. And I'm just like, man, like what was he gonna say? Like what was Wolverine going to ask for? And I would love to know you guys' thoughts and theories down in the comments. Just let me know, because it kind of feels like we got a Wolverine 2.0 coming up around the corner. But it's from here the three of them, they have to leave immediately and they head to this off-site facility in San Francisco, to where at this point heading out there to San Francisco, like this site, it is an ally company with Krakowa, but the people working there, they're pretty much all human. So the stakes are way higher, because whoever dies there, like they're just dead. So it's pretty critical that they try to minimize as many casualties as possible. But what is wild, like when the three of them head out there, Team X-Force, first responders, what's crazy is that this group of mercs, they know that they're heading out this way, and they rigged the door that they're supposed to pass through with explosives, so that when the bomb went off, only pieces of them made it through. And so in San Francisco, you just have like the top half of Wolverine in Kid Omega's head, which still has Logan alive, but for Kid Omega, man, it's Omega, bruh. Like we not gonna see him for a little while. But luckily, and pun very much intended, for Domino, she was the last one going through and not a piece of her passed through when the portal was shut down. But even so, she is ticked and she's ready to get to San Francisco ASAP. One, to save Wolverine and return the favor like when he came to save her, but also she wants to get some payback because she believes these guys are the same ones who held her in South Korea and put her through all that rigorous torture. And this is kind of what I meant by like, you know, with the whole thing of the mutants being able to be brought back, like who's to say that some of the psychological damage won't stay with them and possibly change them forever. And as far as Domino, like the torture she's been through, not only did it put her mind in a mess, but it also has her ready to get revenge. But it's here with Beast and Sage, who have been running point in like literally from the location in Krakowa called The Point, which is the same place where they had the initial meeting with Charles about X-Force, just as a reminder. But it's here with the two of them, they call for Gateway to assist Domino immediately and get her out to San Francisco. And in the case of Gateway, who's kind of just chilling, like the message to him to head out there, it comes through Black Tom Cassidy, who at this point in time is still dealing with a few personal issues, and mainly with his recent insecurity about being Krakowa's chief security advisor, with the addition of Charles dying on his watch, and also about 10,000 voices running through his head at any given moment. And it's like we briefly get a glimpse of his frustration while he's trying to tell Gateway that he's needed by Domino, but it also appears like Gateway's ignoring him. but he essentially gets Gateway to head down there by taking the ground out from underneath him. And for Gateway, it's like, man, I'm falling to my death, so I might as well just open up this portal and head over there to wherever he's trying to get me to go. But as far as back over in San Francisco, to where at this point this heist team is just looting all kinds of Krakowan technology, and one of the mercs is just like, look man, tell me specifically what we gotta get, because we gotta get up out of here. And the dude that's with him is like, relax, we blew up the door, the mutants ain't got no way in here. And just like that, he's stabbed through the back by half a Wolverine who's still alive. And like, it would have been perfect like if right here he would have been like, you guys thought you were safe, and when you're safe you're weak. Because essentially I feel like that's like the mantra of X-Force so far. And like their theme song is like, it ain't safe, it ain't safe, it ain't safe, it ain't safe. But either way, the dude who was already paranoid, he freaks out and he completely just unloads on Wolverine, because apparently missing half a body just wasn't cutting it. But right after this, Forge, Domino, and Gateway make their way there. But as soon as the three of them get there, like Domino is showing no mercy. And it's like, you can tell like this is very personal for her. And even still, keep in mind, like we're not sure if this is the same group. And I mean, as far as who they were sent by, like we don't know if this is the same group from South Korea. But in this moment, like you couldn't tell her that. But while she's here taking these dudes out left and right, like Beast is trying to tell her like, we need some survivors. We need to ask them questions. Like save a few for the interrogations. But she ain't hearing none of that. She on the kill streak. But even still, while this is happening, Forge, he brought the other half of Wolverine and he pretty much just splunched them back together. But for Domino at this point, and barely with Forge's help so far, like they have the mercenaries on the run. But even still with that, like Domino is cleaning house. Like she is taking no prisoners whatsoever. And like when it comes down to like the last mercenary left, Beast is just yelling in her ear like, leave one, we need to figure out who sent them, we need to figure out what they're after. Because at this point they really don't know how many enemies they have. And like for Domino, like the way she sees it, like this guy, he doesn't have anything to give up as far as information, because in her eyes she just believes that he's just another manufactured mercenary. But as it turns out, this dude's like, no, I have memories, I have a dog, his name is Rufus, and he lets her know like, I'm not enhanced, I have allergies. But it's here that they find out that he does have some type of information to share that will be of value, and for that reason Domino spares him. But when he's taken into one of the Krakowan interrogation rooms, Beast doesn't get much out of him. And it's not like he's necessarily lying to Beast, but he's not telling all the truth. Because as far as his explanation, he just tells them like, well, the X-Men, like you guys are rich and we're just coming for you guys for the money, nothing else. And it's like, sure, that may be true, but at the same time, Jean knows that there's more information that she can pull from him. And when Jean goes in, it's here that we find out that their buyer, it's none other than the same masked figure with the peacock tattoo, who may not have sent them, but he's definitely buying whatever they're stealing. Like this guy stays connected somehow, some way. Alright, so when it comes to X-Force as a team, we've kind of talked about how like the structure is set up, and we've often got this analogy of them being Krakowa's CIA, of which they very much are. And it's like with this, aside from handling matters that the X-Men would just publicly take care of, it's like now more than ever, they need X-Force to handle the matters which are still crucially important, but even still they don't necessarily need the name of Krakowa just stamped all over it. Because when we start to see more of the things that they're getting involved with, then we start to understand like, okay, well if the United Nations, if they had caught wind of Krakowa poking their finger in all these different matters, then this could easily just start another world war. So for that reason, even with doing questionable missions, on top of that, they then had to take questionable actions in order to cover their tracks. So now, much like how we'd seen this play out with Charles Xavier and along with Magneto, soliciting the help of Emma Frost and making the votes go in their favor in order to make Krakowa a sovereign nation, well, that was nothing compared to some of the stuff we're about to talk about X-Force doing. And so now the way this works, with this team operating under Charles and Magneto, of course, but under them, everyone here answers to Beast, which is super intriguing. And it's not like he's never led before or he's incapable of doing so, because he's very capable. But along with that, we know that there's this conflict there with him being someone who's usually more passive, but even still, he's the one who has to lead this team and make the tough call. But as Beast would describe, like his working relationship or even just the collaboration of this whole team, it's very much like an orchestra. And at this time, while the field teams in Terra Verde and Beast and Sage are over at the point, he even gives us the breakdown of how like the different members are like different musicians or even instruments, with Kid Omega much like your violin, which I would imagine with plenty of staccato. And there's Domino, who's like a saxophone, Sage, who can really just be any instrument she needs to be, with serving the purpose of creating different harmonies. And then there's Wolverine, who's just like the beating drums and crashing cymbals, which sounds pretty simple on the surface, but it's like, what's an orchestra without that? But then you have Jean, who's like your versatile cello, which can hit notes that are extremely high or even extremely low. But all in all with this, Beast, he is the conductor. He controls the pacing, and when Sage collects information, he has to go through it and decide what they're gonna do with it. And when it comes to the means of protecting Krakowa and seeing their goals come to fruition and protecting many of the secrets which fall in between, if there has to be bribes, it's done. If there's wiping memory that needs to be done, consider it done. If a laboratory needs to be burnt down and made to look like an accident, then it's up to him to make that call and for X-Force to execute. And so now for a little backstory on this recent mission, Charles Xavier had recently went down to Terra Verde to convince the president to sign a treaty, and with doing so he was accompanied by Black Tom Cassidy, who, keep in mind, he took the recent assassination of Charles Xavier pretty personal. And while they were here in a different country for a similar purpose, he was very adamant about not letting history repeat itself. But also while they're here, the president, he announced that for whatever reason, he had declined to sign the treaty, and as soon as that happened, he was attacked. And at the time, no one really knew who these individuals were, with them stating that the mutants aren't in charge, and neither is the president. And even when they initiated this attack, the president wasn't seriously harmed, but rather he only had a few scratches and scuffs. And in the case of Charles Xavier, he wasn't harmed at all. And as Black Tom would describe it, like with him of course protecting Xavier first, but right after that, him telling them if they know what's good for them, they leave. Black Tom then takes the news back to Beast like, yeah, they ran because they was afraid of me. And Beast kind of hits him with the, yo, that's crazy. But also at the time, even with still hearing this heroic tale, Beast still had his suspicions of not only who or what these people were, but what was the true reason of them coming there. And as it turns out, with Sage examining the footage, they then come to find out that as it appears, these creatures were actually after the president's son, which most likely means that they wanted some type of leverage on the president and force his hand for whatever reason by threatening him with his son's safety. And it's for this reason that both Beast and Jean go to see the president themselves to get more information on who these creatures are and perhaps what's their motive. But for President Kokum, the very arrival of Beast and Jean spooked him because with the kidnapping of his son, he was informed that if he had reached out for any outside help, then his son would be killed. So when they arrived, he was just like, no, get out of here, I cannot talk to you. But of course with Jean there, the talking part isn't necessarily needed, because much like we've seen her do with others before, she just reaches into his mind and pulls the information that they need. And as it turns out that these creatures that had attacked him, they were once telefloronic scientists who had been infected by their work, and though it's unclear who their leader is at this time, this plant-based technology is something that the president has been well aware of for a long time, because for quite some time, President Kokum and the scientists of Terra Verde, they have been developing telefloronic technology, which works a lot like nanotech, but only with organic materials, but ideally its programming could work on a cellular level. And with doing so, not only would this breakthrough help Terra Verde's economy, but would also create this microorganism solution that could enter bodies on a cellular level, cure diseases, amongst many other benefits. But as you may have guessed it, when Krakowa came out with their drugs, which succeeded pretty much overnight at doing what Terra Verde was trying to do for years, this then caused Terra Verde to lose a number of funding, both in investors and in potential customers, because the nation of Krakowa had figured it out first, which is partially the reason why the president did not want to collaborate with Charles Xavier and sign the treaty. But after this encounter, that's something that would soon change, because once Beast and Jean get the information that they need, he tells Jean to wipe the mind of everyone here except for the president, in doing so mainly so that the president knows that when this is all said and done, that he is in Krakowa's depth. And so from here, jumping to the next day, which is pretty much where the narrative started. But at this point with X-Force, when they're pretty much ambushed by these telefloronic scientists, it's not only here where Beast realizes that they've weaponized this technology, but he's also come to the realization that these enhanced beings are on par with Omega Sentinels, and for that reason he has to treat them as an equal threat, because if this breakthrough is either sold or stolen, it could also lead to the extinction of the mutant race. And if you really think about it, like if the Sentinel program got a hold of the telefloronic developments and research, like they could practically turn the whole planet into the next mother mold, and at that point there's no combating that. But this is just an example of the things that Beast has to foresee when he has to make those tough decisions. And along with that, because Sage has suggested that they leave no witnesses, which is why Beast had Jean wipe the other minds back at the president's mansion, but with that, in addition to Hank's evaluation of these dudes turning themselves into weapons which are on par with Omega Sentinels, Beast then gives the order for Jean to take these dudes out, which initially she does argue because because one of the main Krakowan laws is kill no man. But Beast very much urges Jean to realize that these guys are on the same path, although it be organic, to developing Omega Sentinels, to developing Nimrod, just as any other engineer with mechanical parts. And with that, in the moment, Jean does what needs to be done, but even still, it doesn't mean that she fully agrees with it. But what we actually come to find out when she catches up with the others is that the president's son actually staged his own kidnapping. And with doing this, his motivation was to force his father's hand because he had believed that his father had given up on the research for telephoronics. And when X-Force figures this out, they of course take him down and they bring him in. But even with this, Beast admits that Hadwin, the president's son, that he was right, because their research with telefloronics, it had made its strides, it was capable of being an alternative to Krakowan medicines, and it eventually became a successful way to weaponize their bodies. But because this poses more of a threat rather than any benefit, Beast then makes like the craziest decision, because he reprograms Hadwin's enhancements to instead be identified to his body as an infection. And I get it, Hadwin had to be stopped, which in the eyes of his father, the president, it seemed like, okay, well, X-Force, we helped you and we found your son, but unfortunately it was just too late. These scientists experimented with him, it went left, and unfortunately there's nothing we can do. And if you think about it, it was either that or expose Hadwin, which would have then destroyed the country's economy. And so it's like there's no way this could have turned out in Hadwin's favor. But even still with that, it may. Because what Beast had thought to be a permanent solution with literally turning this dude into a vegetable, and with doing that burning down his lab in hopes of putting an end to telefloronics. But when this was done, Hadwin had actually broken down and reconstructed, and with doing so, he is still out there on the loose. Like the dude just straight up turned into a smoothie and just dripped out the window. And though this is something that is not going to be like your immediate threat, but even still, much like what we had seen with horticulture, I believe that Hadwin is a problem that we'll see later on. And if not a problem in addition to horticulture, then aside from that, I would say that horticulture is probably the only group who could stop this guy, with the horticulture bomb, which as of right now is targeted at Krakowa. Alright, so at this point, jumping back in and starting with Domino, who's still physically dealing with some of the trauma, and really physically and mentally, with having her skin stolen and used by the assassins who made their attack on Krakowa, who had previously made their attack on Charles Xavier. But even with that, there's a couple of things to keep in mind here, because one, she's still alive with the physical scars, which is one of those things at this point in time that doesn't necessarily validate a resurrection, which in theory physically would give her a clean slate. And it's kind of had her in this place where she's like stuck in the middle, because she's lucky enough not to die, but even still she has this constant reminder of the torture she had endured. But I want to stay on that lucky enough part for just a little bit, because since Kid Omega and Wolverine had rescued her, like in every situation since then, Domino has just been lucky enough, which for her has been the type of thing that begged the question, like, where did her luck go? And fast forward to now, we start to get a bit of that answer, because when Sage informs her of these recent assassinations, which have been taking place to where someone who has been killing humans who are heavy supporters of mutants, and with doing so hitting like these crazy shots. And I'm talking about hitting a guy on a speedboat, like you have the water bouncing around, the speed he's going at, the reflection of the sun, like it's a shot that would be virtually impossible. But as it turned out, he was someone who helped with negotiations for Krakowa and heavily invested in X-Corp. But then on top of that, going from Italy to Toronto, it's there where we have another assassination of a journalist who always wrote positive articles about mutants. But he was taken out with another impossible shot, because it went across the street, through the pizza guy, through the pizza, and it hit like 3 toppings, and the initials of the toppings, okay, well, it just went through the pizza and it hit the guy. That'd have been crazy if it hit like one of each ingredient. But either way, these shots are not supposed to be possible. But as it turns out, this is exactly what Domino had asked Sage to look out for. And it's here where she explains to Sage why, which as we talked about is Domino losing her luck. And she even gives Sage the example of rolling the dice and hitting the snake eyes. But even with her losing her luck, she knows that it's not just like it's disappeared, but rather it's gone somewhere. And this is why she had asked Sage to be on the lookout. But in addition to this new threat, you also have like the psychological cost of the events that have taken place, because Domino still has nightmares of her being captured and having her skin taken. And so now part of this really goes back to something that's been like an argument from day one, which we've been talking about since House of X, as far as the trauma that different mutants endure, whether they're being killed or whatever the case, and that being taken lightly because they can just come back. But even like we talked about recently with the Omega Red coming to Krakowa video, like all because people could come back, worst case, like that doesn't necessarily mean like their mental scars will necessarily heal. And to quote Wolverine, to quote Wolverine, immortality does not fix mental drama. Wait, that ain't it either. Okay, immortality don't erase trauma. Man, I was about to misquote the heck out of that. But even still, the misquote wasn't wrong, but it just wasn't what he said. But as far as immortality not erasing trauma, it's a very true statement. Even though Wolverine is not the best example of that, with him living for so long and having been through so much, which was really part of his argument to Magneto at the time, because everybody's not built like Logan, who could go through all of this and like just sleep like a baby. And in the case of Domino, who's still having nightmares from her torture, she very much finds herself in that place where she can't sleep at night. So in an attempt to burn off some energy and make herself go back to sleep, she goes for a run on the beach, and it's here where she runs into Colossus. And for him at this point in time, he's very much feeling the same way, which is why he's out here painting on the beach just to free his mind. And as far as him painting, I think it was pretty cool to see that, because he's always been like this crazy good artist. And so when it comes to a comic character drawing a comic character, his work was pretty much lifelike. But the thing to pay closer attention to here, like while he's on the beach in Krakowa, which is where mutants are supposed to feel safe, but instead he has his guard up with his skin in its still form. And Domino immediately recognizes it, and she knows that he understands, because back around the same time that Charles Xavier sent Domino on her mission, Colossus was also sent to Russia as part of his task to travel to different locations and extract different mutants who were forbidden to pass through the gates and make their way to Krakowa. But during his time in Russia, he had seen some terrible things, and although at this point he's physically recovered, he still very much feels like he's out there, because the images that he had seen are still fresh in his memory, as well as the pain that he endured while he was out there. And if you think about it, with the two of them being more or less soldiers for Krakowa, or more or less a soldier and a CIA agent, but in addition to that, it's like they have their PTSD that is just getting buried in more and more trauma. But not long after this, Domino goes to meet back up with Sage, who also has updates on these lucky kills, with one of the next targets being a priest from the Order of X. But it's here where Sage pulls a pretty smart move, because when it comes to gambling, for example, on one hand someone can win because they have a lot of luck, but also depending on the game that you're playing, you could create your own luck if you know enough information and you're good at math. And for Sage, her method of trying to track down who's doing this is very comparable to like someone counting cards. And in that reference, it's not like you're at the mercy of the dealer, but rather you're looking at the cards that are on the table and you're able to figure out more or less what card the dealer's about to flip over or even pull from the stack. But with this approach, Sage puts together the next likely target because she's found consistency in the assassin's direction, plus the assassin strikes once a week, and all of the targets have one thing in common, because even with their different professions, each of them have been heavily influential in some type of pro-mutant cause. And this is what brings Domino out to a keynote at the Sierra Institute, which is being given by Elise Irene Owsley, who had actually written a book 10 years ago about mutant sovereignty. And as it turned out, Sage had hit the blackjack, so to speak, because this was that assassin's next target. And I really like how they played this in order to figure out where the assassin was, because on one hand you have two different players gambling, but in the case of Domino and Sage, you once again have that consistency of the mutants breaking the rules in a way, with not fully depending on luck, but rather creating their own luck in order to get the job done. But even with that, here's the thing, because even though Domino has found this assassin, like finding the assassin is one thing and catching the assassin is another, because when Domino chases this assassin down to the Big Woods casino, she then quickly comes to find out that the teal cloak that the assassin was wearing, like that thing had to been on sale or something, because everybody rocking it. And for Domino at this point, who's trying to guess who it is, she's not able to find them because it's like luck isn't on her side, which is pretty crazy, because at this exact same time, like this assassin who's getting away, they then push the button on this random machine, and when they do, it hits all sevens. And when this is done and we see the person who has stole Domino's luck, who very much looks like Domino but in a reverse colorway, but where she hits this random jackpot and gets away, it begins to show us like Domino's luck is always active, but where it comes to these two, when it switches on for one, it switches off for the other. And so from here we jump over to London, to where we follow this faux Domino, who at this point has moved on to her next target, who I believe was like a prime minister that she seduced. And as she prepares for her method of termination with pulling like that strangling cord from behind her ear, it's like off the bat we're reminded like, hey, that's the same kind of modification that we'd seen from the autopsy of those assassins who had made their way to Krakowa. But when she makes her way to check out this minister, Domino is already there, which once again is much credit to Sage for helping her find the next target, allowing Domino to find her and get here in time. But so much like in the last case where the faux Domino had the luck play in her favor, in this case it very much switches back around, because here after a short scuffle, Domino's able to take her out, which feels like once again the luck switching off for one and switching on for the other. But after this, when Domino takes the body of this assassin back to Krakowa, to where they carry out the autopsy within the healing garden, which I guess is like the designated spot for all the autopsies. But when they do this, to no surprise, like this assassin was very much constructed like the others which we had seen before, but instead of this one having Domino's skin grafted onto her, we come to find out that Domino's DNA has been woven throughout her whole body. But also come to find out, like upon this assassin's death, Domino does feel the luck coming back, which is confirmed when she finds a 4-leaf clover in Krakowa, which is like a 1 in 10,000 odds. And Domino's used to finding at least hundreds of these a day. But at least with finding this one, Domino knows that taking out this assassin, it has brought back a piece of herself, which at this point is progress after all she's been through. And to kind of commemorate this win, she gives the clover to Sage, who is also a huge help in Domino getting that part of her back. But even still, it's not like this solves everything, because Domino still finds herself having trouble sleeping at night, and she comes to find out, like if she continues to move, whether it's jogging or going for a swim, that these activities help suppress her anxiety. And at this time when she goes for a swim, she once again runs into Colossus, and when they meet here, they have a very deep moment, because while they're here, Colossus offers for Domino the opportunity for him to take the both of them out of their misery, and Domino says no. And even though they would resurrect, like that's aside from the point, because Domino's come to the point where she realizes that these scars have made her better, and had she accepted Pete's offer, that would very much be like a way of running, and that's never the answer, even when you have this supposed guarantee of coming back. And like for whatever reason, this reminds me of playing like GTA Online, because you have this option, like if your character gets stuck somewhere, you have this option in the menu to kill yourself, and I never select that option. And I understand within that example it's just a game, but I am a firm believer, like on a serious note, like you got to be careful, like the way that you think to yourself, the way you speak to yourself, because your subconscious really doesn't know the difference. And I like here with Domino that she tells Colossus like she wants to remember, she needs to remember, because even though this world that they live in, it isn't perfect, but at the same time, running away from a problem has never made it better, ever. But after this, when Sage calls in Domino to check out some suspicious activity over in St. Petersburg, to where a mysterious figure just walks by these tanks, and they begin to just touch and test the Krakowan gate. And Sage admits it's hard to tell if this person is working with the tanks, or if the tanks just didn't see him, like as if they have gotten lucky just sneaking by the tanks. But she had also noticed that this person also had skin much like Domino. But also with following up on this, Sage had gotten an idea from the clover which Domino had given to her, because with Domino having signs of her luck returning back to her, instead of clovers appearing 1 in every 10,000, they would then appear hundreds in every 10,000. So with knowing that, Sage did a search for a similar activity, to where she then found a hit, but it was on the move, which likely meant a lab much like the one they had found in Korea. It was back up and functional, but in this case it was a moving laboratory. And this time when Domino goes to check it out, she brings Colossus with her, and she also points out, like for her, though she's been moving non-stop since her traumatic encounter, but Colossus on the other hand, he hasn't moved since his, so hopefully bringing him out here helps him out. But when they jump their way onto this moving container, which they had to do from another train which was passing by because they couldn't teleport in, but when they break their way into it, they find the container they land in is filled with blood. And after that, the next one that they smash into, it's much like the laboratory which Domino was held in, which without a doubt lets them know that they're in the right place. But in addition to that, as if this wasn't proof enough, they're then met with the arrival of all the soldiers from the next container, which is pretty much a whole army of Dominoes. And so like in this case, with them clearly being outnumbered and outgunned, Colossus then takes the only reasonable means of taking down a number of Dominoes, which apparently is just knocking them all down. And with Domino understanding what needed to be done, she's also fatally injured, but she makes Colossus make her one promise, because with her still knowing that she'll be resurrected and brought back, she also makes him promise that he won't let her forget anything. And before she goes, he makes that promise. And it's pretty crazy because it's almost like Domino is challenging Colossus just to be a better person, and I can dig that. But that'll do it for this one, guys. And real quick, I just want to give a shout out to all the Patreons. Thank you all for supporting the page and really just helping me balance out the YouTube roller coaster algorithm. And so if anyone wants more information on how to become a Patreon, I got a link down below that'll take you to patreon.com/dopespill for more information.